This is IBM Museum. I'm back to a little bit of a channel theme here and returning to running the system information tool. Once again, I've run through a lot of models in previous videos. And remarkably, this is actually the easiest setup that I've done for the system information tool. And the reason for that is that I have a few of these machines that are in near identical condition that were stored away at a place. And it's a bit of an unusual system. It's got a little bit of history on how it arrived, that IBM went through and made a model for it. I'll go over that history. I do have some separate planars on the side as well. We'll open up the lid in this, in addition to running the system information tool. And you can see from the front of this, it's not a real good, I'll go through and I can zoom in on the badge, but you can see that some things look a little bit out of place as it is. If you're used to the PS2 Model 55SX that I've shown on previous videos, or even the Model 3286, that diskette drive being over there on the right hand side, there even being a hard drive access light on the front. And so let me go through and I'll get zoomed in, and in fact I'll turn off my my internal webcam, and here's the system on my camcorder. Let's go through and see if I can get this set up for zooming in. On this. So this is the IBM PS2 Model 53, and I've often seen it as the 53 SLC2, but it has it marked here on the badge, PS2 53 46 SLC2. So quite a bit of information in that badge on that one line for the model number. Yeah, get back here to a good view. And some of these bezels there, this is actually about the most yellowed for the front bezel. In pretty good shape otherwise. The covers are in pretty good shape. A little bit of scuffs and marks on them, as we saw when we went through and zoomed in. And I've gone through and I actually connected this up and powered it on. Ultimately, I wanted to make sure that everything was working before I went through the video. I do have some other units I have that are actually configured identically, and I think there's a little bit of hint as I went through and it loaded what I had, and I don't even know necessarily how I came by this model. I did have an indication of a local business that had been here in my local town many years ago. Is not in existence anymore. In fact, they've gone through and torn down the building where that was, the lot, and changed things around, put up a new structure. But it went through, it booted up. I did go through and I set The time and date ultimately, once I kind of figured out it would work, it thought it was back in June 14th of 1999. So clearly the that aspect was off, but otherwise the configuration was still there. And let me go through, this is kind of the model introduction portion, and I'll show the planar. I've got a couple of them stacked here. And probably let's get out this one on the bottom because this is a little bit more informative. Right off the bat, I'll probably, I can keep on my camcorder, probably for the good, the best view. And I think I'll just probably move the planar. I'll remember where my webcam was here, but let's get it off to the side, get it out of the way. And the BIOS label is a little bit loose. I went through and I looked back months ago just to find out what capacity that chip was and get a little bit of indication of whether I could go through and put it in my EEPROM reader. And for this view, I mean, we see kind of right there in the center what looks to be a very familiar, along with all these QA, I guess they're quality assurance stamps or something else there in the center, quite a few of them, that we do see kind of a familiar icon or image of reply. And I actually believe that this one is a with the BIOS here, I believe it's actually IBM, but I don't really have any idea right off the bat. And indeed, this planar started as from the reply. It was called the Reply 55, and it was a substitution for the 55SX planar. Very successful. I do have some other branded systems I knew were that IBM customers went through and replaced these planars on their own to put this in place of that 55SX with mostly to just get by and update the 386SX 16 megahertz that was in that 55SX. And this planar is quite, I mean, has some a little bit more modernized. Now, firing up the system, I need to go through and check these Nikon capacitors and around them with a microscope, because on the replay planars, in some cases, these capacitors were known for a little bit of leaks. I do have a MUL 70 planar ultimately from Reply that IBM rebranded, and it's got a little bit of leaks of these capacitors. But just going around the board, let's go through and focus on the horsepower in the first place. Okay, so this is the IBM 486 SLC2 50 megahertz CPU. And so it's got the limitations of that 16-bit data bus, 24-bit address bus, but it's a little peppy CPU for ultimately a 16-bit CPU, able to run all of the Intel 486SX instructions, the 486 without the math coprocessor, and even has some instructions itself that are separate, and even what's called model-specific registers to control this. and set it up, because it does have 16 KB of L1 cache that's inside the chip. And that really helps with the performance as well. And just like the name SLC2, it is a clock doubled CPU internally. So it's 25 megahertz externally for the bus connections and 50 megahertz internally. And of course, this CPU was used on other IBM systems that we've covered before. You'll see the Intel copyright date there of 1985, and then IBM 1992. IBM was allowed to modify the code mask of the 386 CPU to basically come up with their own versions. A lot of that stipulation was that those CPUs would be put on only IBM systems. They were not offered as necessarily as upgrades, was the arrangement that Intel had with them. We do have the coprocessor socket there, and that is a 386 a 387 SX or 387 SL CPU. 25 megahertz would be the rating for the, if you have the chip in the socket. If you had a 20 megahertz, you could probably overclock it by just that 20%. I've done that before to have something that works. If you weren't able to find a 387 SX floating point unit that for that. And of course, the 387 SL would be able to do the 25 megahertz. Sometimes those even were even marked as 33 megahertz. So, kind of on the system side, and it does have the IBM FRU. In fact, let's rotate the board. And so I can get a little bit further in my explanation here as I kind of continue over the components. This is so successful that IBM went through, as you kind of recognize from the FRU, and they used this planar themselves. They rebranded it. They had their own BIOS in there. This may be even a system that, a planar that they had that was marked as the reply, went through, the BIOS was changed, and it was became also the model 55 LS 486. And you're saying, well, wait, that's different from this system here. Well, it also, very same planar also became the model 53 SLC2. It was used in two places for IBM's systems, and how it branded. Those were marked in their badges, the 55 LS 486, or as we saw the badge on the front of this, as that Model 53 SLC2, but otherwise the BIOS and everything else was identical between those units, the IBM BIOS that they put on there. And the 55 LS 46 actually has the conventional 55 SX style case. The front bezel is that old standard and has the diskette drive, even though it's an LS model marked as a LAN station, does have that diskette drive on the left, and then the internal drive here on the right. Now, that's the connectors here, and you can see, even the shroud is keyed the same way, the same color and everything else. And this could, be an issue if you're not paying attention. But There is a silk screen ultimately on this back one, and that is marked as IDE 40 pin, and the this lower one here on the screen is marked as floppy. So that's a diskette drive connector, and this is actually to where the IBM convention of the power on the diskette drive. The pinout for this IDE connection, that is standard IDE, and requires a separate power for an IDE drive. And that's part of the success, is that IBM, and these still have that long block addressing issue, that you could only go up to the 512 megabyte or 540 megabyte drives that were out on there. But it was, those IDE drives are a vast improvement over the DBA ESDI drives that were in the 55SX. And we'll get to that at a later point. I did talk about this on the Facebook group here recently. I don't have the riser here, but this ultimately does have, with that riser in place, and you use the 55SX riser, even though the planar was different. When you got the reply board, you just used your same riser that you had with your system. And that's even remarkable for all those the risers that the 55SX had over its lifespan of going through to where the riser could be a lot older functionally than this planar. But at the top of that riser is the connection for the DBA ESDI drive. And the BIOS, I mean, it's going to take a little bit of investigation on how, between even the Reply BIOS and the IBM BIOS, of how it ranks basically the IDE drive over the DBA ESDI, of whether that DBA ESDI drive is even recognized. And of course, clearly for the Reply 55 planar upgrade, you kept your same hard drive, or you could keep your same hard drive in operation. The 55LS 486 that IBM supplied, a lot of time that went through and that used the DBA ESDI drive from what I've seen. And I'll have to look at even the pocket reference and see what it lists on that for the models. But you may have the ability to go through that may have been deactivated in BIOS later on for like the 53 SLC2, like the system we have down here. But the this may have the potential to run both the IDE drive and the DBA ESDI drive at the same time. Now, you see the 3 SIM slots. This even went through, I think in the slots, this is able to recognize the 8 megabyte, 70 nanosecond SIMs. And you even have the 3. And of course, I don't know if that's a matched memory in some configurations, if you have the 4 megabyte sticks in there for performance or kind of an interleaving or anything like that. But it's nice that you could even have, you could easily gain the 16 megabyte system limitation for that 24-bit address CPU. 16 megabyte is the limit for a system like that. The 286 CPU and the 386 SX CPU. But you could easily reach that capacity on the just on the system planar without having an adapter in there, memory adapter, memory expansion adapter, and people like that too. That's why the board was popular. These do, and it's actually interesting that the diskette drive I do have in this unit is the 2.88 megabyte. And it does have the ability to support that, and of course we'll see in the system information tool on how that's recognized. I actually believe that this header ought to see how they do power for the IDE drive. And this I do have, and this is a factory configuration of the system. Looking at the RAM, we'll see that when we go to power it up. That's expanded all the way out, but as far as the hard drive and diskette drive, I believe that this is pretty much stock. And I would have to look to see, these units may have came with the that 2.88 megabyte drive or just the 1.44 megabyte standard diskette that IBM used on a lot of the PS2s. This planar, I do have the two because I noticed one of the things right up is, and this is more common with the reply branding and things like that, that they actually have a glass cartridge fuse on this one for the keyboard. And a lot of time with the planar from IBM, this one doesn't have the marking for the reply. It's got even more of the barcodes and things like that for going through and automatically reading them. It's not really necessarily printing out the FRU so much. It's going to an electronic side, and but that has a different surface mount fuse that's here. And of course, reply, it looks like they designed where you could use the surface mount or the glass cartridge. You just had whichever side. And then of course this marking on the BIOS, it didn't have any label or anything else otherwise. And I think this chip is a little bit different from what I can read, even though my EEPROM reader is pretty good. I don't think I can read these, and I'm really a lot of time I'm hesitant to pull these out of the socket. I just like powering the system on. I got a little debug script I can go through and read the BIOS a lot of the time for the machines. There's issues with the flash-based stuff and things like that, but that's a better way for me to go through and to read the BIOS. I was interested in whether the configuration would be there, because these do have the Dallas DS13 instead of the 1287. So the DS1387, and they say real-time ramified, because in addition to the DS1287 circuitry, real-time clock and basic CMOS storage, these do have 2 KB of non-volatile RAM that's battery backed up. We had seen these on the NCR systems as well. NCR went through and used these pretty heavily. So did Reply on a lot of the boards, the turbo boards, the power boards for the different systems. And this also had Cirrus Logic video on it, kind of an SVGA, the 5426 video chip, and then this is the VRAM for that. And it's got, this will be a megabyte of VRAM, and then it's got, if somebody were to put on sockets or something else for that VRAM expansion up to 2 megabyte would be conceivably possible. Sometimes the drivers for like Windows 95 and so like that, they can be limited to 1 megabyte of VRAM and won't recognize that second amount of VRAM. I think the Windows NT driver goes through and does recognize the 2 megabyte. We'll wrap, and I'll try and timestamp this video. We'll kind of wrap up the end by the ports. Pretty much a standard appearance, just like the 55SX, where we've got the VGA connection, serial, 25 pin, and no other header there around the serial, and that's done for the purposes of Louis Olin. He found some of the PS2s that had a abbreviated header that would be close to the serial port. That looks like it was used in a telephony application. And then the parallel port, this still does do the postcodes from the parallel port, and then mouse and keyboard ports. So then we have jumpers, and I'll go through and I'll list there is information on the page, and this is diagrammed and everything else for the jumper settings, the aspect of that on the planar for, we do know the layout and have that diagram of the planar. I'm trying to remember. I don't know if I have I don't think I have high resolution photos of this. I may have that. I don't think they're up on the page, but that's something I can certainly get going. Let's go through, and just as part of the that same follow-up to the planar, we're going to go through, before we get into the system information tool, I'll go through and I'll pop the cover. Now, one of the things that made me select this unit, of course, I looked inside these. I had the cover on there, but none of the screws attached. Was that I do have a label, and I marked it as MUL53 reference that I had in this diskette drive, so I was pretty sure that this had worked. And this is, I guess, now looking at it, and I do have one of these units that's actually stamped with a date code here, and it's late. It's like November of 1993 for that stamped date code that's here, and on this drive cage, because the inside of this, I mean, from the 55SX and the MUL3286 case, IBM did go through, and in addition to those drives being changed around, the drive positions being changed around, they did modify and had more of an assembly for the drive carrier there, different from the 55SX and 286. I do see the marking, the pin marking. This is marked as 8595, and so this is likely a diskette drive that I put in place here from a Model 95, either a Type 1 or Type 2 complex, and that would be probably marking. I'd have to look to see that whether this is got that asterisk on the eject button. But otherwise, I think this is relatively stock. I may have gone through and done the SIMs in here. Those are 8 megabyte SIMs, as I kind of found out earlier. I'm just going through as an easy way to go through and quickly show the board. Here is the drive power. It's interesting that, you know, that they even have an extra connection past for the IDE drive. This IDE drive is stock on the system, and it does come up from that header, that 3-pin header that we saw on the planar over here, being used for the power, and a little wiring harness that IBM did. We do see kind of the, as I said, you know, you have the riser of the 55SX effectively in there, and then they just have the plug in here because you've got the DS1387 for that battery backup, so you don't have a battery carrier over here, but it does have the speaker up front here behind this bracket, and then, you know, the ability to rotate that plug for clearing the password in there, just like the 55SX had. So you can see a little bit there to and it's actually black SIM sockets that are on the planar in this model. And this is probably a little bit more of the IBM, you know, planar that not necessarily that went through Reply's hands, that they went through a little bit more for the branding and everything else. And of course, I'm expecting the BIOS for this should be straight IBM as well. And on this, I find this at times they actually masked out a portion. They had FRU that was listed on the 46 SLC2 CPU that they went through and blotted that out basically, and then they have the FRU above that printed. Same thing though, that Intel copyright date and IBM copyright date. Otherwise, pretty much bog standard for the way that those disembodied planars that I have showing what's there. And I'll probably go through, I can take this opportunity and we'll get the cover back on. I'll go through and I'm going to bring up the web page for this, and just to kind of show that, and then we'll get started on going through the system information tool on this unit. And I've got my remote for my clear click box to switch to the video from this machine at that point. But let me get spun around. Careful of my microphone cable. I'm going to go through and I'll pause and get that page up for the Model 53 and just briefly cover that. Okay, so here is the page on the PS2 Model 53, and that is the type 9553 on the Art Tool website. And you've got links to the reference diskette and a diagnostic diskette, pre-standard fare at the Ardent Tool for covering the models. And I'm going to get through to where we can interact with this page. I'll just kind of briefly scroll through to show, and I'll have a link to this in the video description. So there's the planar diagram, identifying all the components which are listed down below. And there is the text in there talking about the origins of this planar from the Reply Corporation. And again, that going both to make the model 55 LS486, as well as the PS2 model 53 SLC2. And it is marked there as only supports 2, 4, and 8 megabyte, 70 nanosecond. So if you had planar memory on your reply, excuse me, on your 55SX before you did the swap, like the reply swap, that memory would likely have to be upgraded as well. Talks a little bit about the diskette drive, the 2.88 megabyte being supported. There's still the remove password, like is very similar to the 55SX. Serial and parallel ports. IDE controller trivia. And even looks like it's able to have the alternate address. And this is a looks to be a pretty non-standard IBM IDE solution, or stemming from the reply. Not, I don't believe that that's the same I/O ports as conventional IDE would use in the system. And then that also selects that IRQ level for the alternate as well. And so you have the ATA fixed disk. It talks about a floppy cable hack. I'm not sure exactly what that does. They're talking about pulling pins. I'm not certain of what that accomplishes. That looks to be kind of the reply convention for the diskette drives that they have on even like the 65 80 turbo board and power board from Reply have that same changed wiring. And then talks about the Windows 95 drivers for the video. And then the graphics mode supported in those video arrangements. Everyone can look over that by the link that I'm going to provide. Talks about the riser, and this being otherwise, a 55SX riser. And a comment from William Walsh talking about the supposedly disabled on the Model 53, and that would be something that we need to go through and check. A different riser bracket. I may go through and just revert back. This is the bottom of the page. The front bezel comes off pretty easily. Opening the case is otherwise very similar to the 55SX. Now I may go back to the system because I wanted to look at that diskette drive cable, as it were, again, just to take a second look. And it is just a standard insulation displacing connector. And it's interesting there. Oh, this is even for a second IDE drive in there, and you could even conceivably have a compact flash adapter in the modern age for being that solid state drive. But that's why you have also the additional power tap there. But the it's just standard gray, and even the cable there does have other diskette drive connections. Of course, the IBM standard with the power over that. I just wanted to peek a little bit again at that. And kind of in the last step of the review of the system, I wanted to go through, and this is the PC and PS2 pocket reference. These little booklets are invaluable. This is February 1996 for this one. I think that there's also an electronic scan of this that's up. And you can get them. I picked up mine years ago. They give all little... I think I've gone through the booklet in brief before. And, okay. So... this is, and it actually looks like this page over here is the problem determination basics. That's generic to, well, I guess this would be maybe linked to the, since they move on to other models. It's interesting that they have a separate problem determination basics for the Model 50 that's paired with, kind of with the Model 53. And going through, they're showing the components there. And it, you know, you look at that diagram, and it's funny. That's just a generic diagram for the 55SX and 3286 because it has that diskette drive over on the left-hand side in that view. And so they talk about there the 1.44 megabyte diskette drive assembly. So that looks like what came stock. Although, as I say, they do support the 2.88 megabyte diskette drive. And then there's your PS2, and it's interesting, PS2 53 logo and PS2 53 LS logo. And the LS meaning land station again. And that may even mean, as I say, and the parts would be very similar for that PS2 55 LS 486 might be the logo that they're referring to there instead. And but that's all the part list and the diagram that's halfway close to, a little bit generic for the for those models that were in the same desktop case. So I just wanted to go through and look at that to show that on screen as well before we get into the system information tool. Now, the system information tool diskette that I have, this is bootable. So I even thought, well, even if the configuration was messed up or the drive was doing something different, that I could still boot from this diskette. I probably want to go through, and we're just going to boot the system for the OS in here because I found it a little bit interesting as well. Of course, I don't have the diskette fully inserted. We'll flip over to the VGA side of things. I'll put that diskette down. I'm actually going to go through and get back on camera here. We're seeing that no signal. And I might go through and kind of readjust the screen as I go through. I probably won't go through and pause it. Let's go through. Let's get the system powered on. Get rid of that no signal. And as you can see on the screen here, I'll get this actually moved over to be a little bit lined differently. but you can actually see the CP codes. It does that a little bit. My clear click does a little bit of that banding of what resolution it's locked on. But you see the CP codes in the lower right-hand corner. And that's just the postcode, just like if you had a postcode reader connected up to the parallel port. Or the later IBM PS2s, they do that to showing the CP codes that were on there. And this is, in fact, I want to make sure I get this. Yeah. And this is as I have it. This has actually got, as we see, that full screen, that gives me where I can shift that to the right place. But this is network. Effectively, this is and this doesn't have a network board in it, but certainly I can put it one in there. And it's just interesting to for me to find a network server effectively in this machine. And even the 3.12 250 user, this doesn't have any of the I-class stuff on there or anything like that. Might be a little bit potential. And you just saw that it seemed to be pretty peppy. I mean, I do have 16 megabyte of RAM on here, and that CPU, that 46 SLC2 50 megahertz CPU does pretty good. So I just wanted to show that, and I can, again, this information for server, that Ridgemar Motors was, I think that was a local business here. Now I'm seeing, I was thinking of Ridgewood. Ridgemar might be, that might have been another location. And I picked these up all in one batch. It might even be interesting to what the other ones have loaded on them when this has the network server. And we're going to go through, we'll exit out of the NetWare console, the monitor, and we'll go through and do a and it's funny because so apparently NetWare 3.12 and I think there's a patch for that to get it to where recognized, but things were in 1921 doesn't recognize the year appropriately there. And so we're going to do a down to get out of the to bring the server down. That would actually notify any stations if it were connected up to the network, that telling the clients that it was going down. And we'll do an exit to get basically to a DOS prompt. And I'll have to see how the system information tool will appear when I run it. And so really at this point, I was interested, IBM DOS version 5.02 revision 0, and we'd see that in the system information tool anyway, because that's what we booted from. So I'm going to go through, go over to my A drive. I hope everything functions here. If not, I can pause and substitute drive. Let's look at what we've got. Is that going to? And I've even got Okay. And we'll just do a fail. It probably asks us for... Okay. Okay. And I have other diskette drives, and it's interesting. We may need that that reference diskette image. I've got my little go-to drives I can swap out in there. So let me go through and pause the video. And wow, we're getting up on 15 minutes of video so far. We'll try and make this brief. So I just pulled out one of my little go-to diskette drives. These actually were like a model very similar to what the PS2 L40SX used, and all the power and everything else. Rather than go through and pull the, I wasn't sure how this diskette drive bezel, if that came off independently, rather than pulling the whole front bezel to get out that diskette drive. It's just easier for me to open the cover, lay that on top, and I'll probably have to go through the, or it might even be worthwhile to go through and have the reference diskette in there. Let's go through, bring that back over to VGA. Powered up, I'll get the screen. I'll work with the screen to get it in the appropriate an appropriate place. And again, we can see those CP codes in the lower right-hand corner. Get myself back up on the screen. Okay, and I didn't see that error if that was like a diskette drive error, so but it went through and it did access the, it looks like I had the 1.10, but we go through and we get to see the in this video we get to see the reference diskette side. And certainly you can go through and pause. Okay. So, and this is typical. I have the memory topped off at that for the (16 megabyte). I want to get the system information tool diskette in there to get booted from that. Rather than going through all the netware angle again. Now the Model 53, and I kind of briefly reviewed Major Tom's list. Since we don't have the auto exec bat, remember it's going through and prompting us for time and date. We can see here we've got the, and I've got the a lot of contents here. I've got the versions of the system information tool. We'll go through and we'll run the latest one that we have, that sit_C. But the from what I saw in a brief review of the recognized systems for the system information tool, the Model 53 is not on that list. So we'll see what is identified here later. I'm going to work with shifting the screen a little bit again. And we're going to go through for the nature of the of what I intended the video of the system information tool. So adapter information, it is microchannel. We don't have any adapters present in these slots. Disk information, hard disk by drive letter, drive C, drive size 5.9 megabyte. And that may just be referring to a partition that it's able to see of the DOS for that network being there. And there's the true capacity of that, like a 128 megabyte drive probably for the. So there's the, okay, so 12-bit fat partition. It's interesting for, yeah. And then the Novell partition that's at least able to recognize being most of the drive contents. We'll have to see how far that Novell installation goes. And of course 1.44 megabyte diskette in there now to get it to work. Okay, so the 101, 102 and the 122 key keyboards are supported. Keyboard ID standard 83AB for the Model M that I have here. Get typomatic rate supported. Set typomatic rate supported. Return to default typomatic rate supported. Memory information. The system is not supported for determining kind of the specifics to the SIMs. I do have a mouse connected, but I don't have the mouse driver still on this system information tool diskette. Miscellaneous technical information. Second interrupt chip is present. Real-time clock is present. Wait on external event is unsupported. Extended BIOS data area is allocated. System has a microchannel bus. System DMA supports 24-bit address space, and that's 16 megabytes for that 24-bit address space. Keyboard functionality call supported. Return POS data call supported. Return memory map call supported. Enable disable processor functions call supported. Because again, that's that 486 SLC2 that has some all specific registers turning, being able to turn the cache on or off in or flush the cache from software. And non-8042 keyboard controller in system. Data streaming is unsupported. SCSI subsystem not present on the system board. Information panel is not installed. This is not an IML system. SCSI support is not in the IML image. IML initial machine load. I don't have the mouse driver loaded. Pretty much standard information here, booting from the diskette. I've got the DOS version 5. Model and processor information. Again, so machine name unknown, processor unknown, coprocessor unknown. Model F8. Again, it's above 386SX or above is F8. Submodel B9. BIOS revision 1, BIOS ROM date of October the 19th, 1993, system board POS ID, the planar ID of E3FE. And that is shared, of course, between all the Reply 55, the model PS2 model 55 LS486, and the PS2 model 53 SLC2. Just tells a number of ports, parallel ports and serial ports, SCSI information, and I'll have to see on how. Okay, and just recognizes as a VGA for all that, it doesn't recognize the particular Cirrus Logic chipset. But that is the system information tool. I could have gone through and even put up that little image below me for the system information tool. And let's get just thinking of kind of doing getting an image up there for the outro. I'll have to just see what YouTube selects for a thumbnail for this very long video. We've gone clearly over an hour. It's like an hour and 10 minutes now. But very informative video going through this model. I believe I touched on everything. I will try and timestamp it as soon as I can, just to make going through the video and pulling up certain segments a little bit quicker. If you enjoyed the content, click on that like button, please, and give me feedback, what you think of the system in the comments. I will have all the populate the video details with the links I talked about. If you're not subscribed to my channel, please consider subscribing and recommend it to your friends so I can get more subscribers. That amount is growing, but I still would like to get higher, of course. But that's all I have for now. This is IBM Museum. Thank you.